Ted Bundy. Charm can be the most dangerous weapon of all. While most people imagine monsters hiding in shadows, the truly terrifying ones walk among us, wearing smiles, speaking politely, looking exactly like the person you might trust to help you carry groceries or give you directions. Ted Bundy understood this better than almost anyone. He was handsome, articulate, educated, the kind of man parents hoped their daughters would bring home. Yet beneath that carefully polished exterior lived something so dark, so calculating, that decades after his execution, his name still sends chills through anyone who hears it. How does evil learn to wear such a convincing mask? Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, under circumstances shrouded in shame and secrecy. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried and only 22 years old. In that era, such situations carried enormous social stigma. To avoid scandal, Ted was raised initially believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his older sister. The deception eventually unraveled, leaving young Ted confused about his identity and place in the world. Did this early betrayal plant seeds of something darker? Or was he simply born with something missing, some fundamental piece of humanity that others possess? He reportedly displayed unusual behavior, including sneaking into neighbors' homes and an early fascination with knives. As he grew older, Ted became skilled at presenting different versions of himself to different people, learning early that the right mask could open any door. By his 20s, Bundy seemed destined for success. He enrolled at the University of Washington, studied psychology, volunteered at a crisis hotline, and even worked for political campaigns. He was charming, confident, the kind of person who could talk his way into or out of almost any situation. He had relationships with women who described him as attentive and caring. One girlfriend in particular seemed to represent everything he wanted in life, but when that relationship ended, something inside him shattered. Friends later noticed changes, a darker edge creeping into his personality. Was the breakup the trigger, or simply the moment when what was already there finally began to surface? The attacks began in 1974, though investigators believe there may have been earlier incidents. Young women started disappearing from college campuses and surrounding areas in Washington and Oregon. They shared certain characteristics: long dark hair parted in the middle, slender build, attractive, often college students. The similarities were too consistent to be coincidence. Bundy was hunting a type, perhaps trying to possess what he felt he had lost, or perhaps simply feeding an appetite that had always existed. His method revealed a predator who understood human nature with chilling precision. He would approach women in public places wearing a fake cast or using crutches, playing the role of someone who needed help carrying books to his car or loading something into his vehicle, who refuses to help someone who appears injured and harmless. Once his targets were isolated, the mask dropped. What followed was violence that investigators would spend years documenting, a trail of victims across multiple states that made Bundy one of the most prolific offenders in American history. He moved from Washington to Utah to Colorado, leaving bodies in his wake. Law enforcement agencies struggled to connect cases across jurisdictions. This was before national databases, before DNA evidence, before the technology that helps track such predators today. Bundy exploited these gaps, moving freely, selecting victims with terrifying randomness. College students, young professionals, even a 12-year-old girl. The victims range across states and circumstances, but the brutality remained consistent. His first arrest came in August 1975, not for his serious crimes, but for a traffic stop in Utah. Police found suspicious items in his car: a ski mask, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick. He was charged with attempted kidnapping after a woman had escaped from him months earlier. Convicted and sentenced to prison, most people assumed that was the end. But Ted Bundy was far from finished. He escaped twice. The first time, he jumped from a courthouse window during a hearing. Recaptured after 6 days, he seemed contained again. Then in December 1977, he escaped a second time from his jail cell in Colorado, making his way to Florida. Free again, he didn't lay low or attempt to disappear quietly. Instead, he committed some of his most horrific acts. On January 15, 1978, Bundy entered a sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. In less than 15 minutes of frenzied violence, he attacked 4 young women, taking the lives of 2 and leaving 2 others severely injured. Less than a month later, he abducted and ended the life of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his youngest known victim. The violence was escalating, the intervals between attacks shrinking. He was spiraling, losing whatever control had previously governed his actions. His final arrest came on February 15, 1978, after a traffic stop in Pensacola. This time, forensic evidence sealed his fate. Bite marks on one of the sorority victims matched his teeth, a groundbreaking use of forensic odontology that helped secure his conviction. During trials in Florida, Bundy chose to represent himself, turning the courtroom into theater. He was charismatic, intelligent, even charming at times, seemingly enjoying the attention. He proposed to and married a woman during the trial, fathering a child while on death row. Even facing execution, he maintained relationships, granted interviews, and cultivated his image. The legal process dragged on for years with appeals and delays. During this time, Bundy became a macabre celebrity. He gave interviews to journalists and investigators, offering insights into criminal psychology, discussing other cases, positioning himself as an expert. He confessed to 30 victims, though investigators believe the actual number was much higher, possibly exceeding 100. He used his confessions strategically, offering information in exchange for delays, maintaining control even as the walls closed in. On January 24, 1989, at age 42, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some celebrating, others protesting capital punishment. His death ended a decade of terror, but left behind questions that still haunt us. How many victims were there really? How did he evade capture for so long? And most troubling of all, how many others like him are out there right now, wearing masks, perfecting their charm, waiting for the right moment? Ted Bundy's legacy isn't just the lives he destroyed, though those losses are immeasurable and permanent. His legacy is the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs. It can be attractive, articulate, seemingly normal. It can volunteer at crisis centers while planning violence. It can smile warmly while calculating cruelty. The monsters we should fear most aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones standing in plain sight, and we invite them in because we never suspect that someone so charming could be so dangerous. Brian Christopher Kohberger. In the early hours of a quiet Idaho morning, nothing appeared out of place. Streetlights hummed, houses stood still, and a college town rested under the illusion of safety. Yet beneath that calm lay a question that would soon haunt an entire nation. What happens when someone who studies crime does not just analyze it, but becomes it? The answer emerged slowly, painfully, and with consequences that would never be undone. On November 13, 2022, the city of Moscow, Idaho, was thrust into shock after 4 University of Idaho students were discovered dead inside an off-campus residence they shared. The victims were young, close-knit, and deeply woven into the social fabric of the university. News spread rapidly, but clarity did not. There was no immediate suspect, no public warning, and no clear explanation. Fear settled into the town like a fog that refused to lift. For days, investigators worked behind the scenes while students left town, parents demanded answers, and the nation watched. Moscow was not a place accustomed to large-scale tragedy. It was known for quiet streets, football weekends, and academic routines. The contrast between that image and the reality of 4 lives lost created a tension that felt unbearable. How could something so devastating occur without anyone noticing until it was too late? As the investigation progressed, law enforcement followed a trail built not on spectacle, but on patience. Surveillance footage, digital data, and forensic analysis slowly narrowed the focus. The evidence pointed toward a man whose background made the case even more unsettling. His name was Brian Christopher Kohberger, a doctoral student in criminology studying nearby. He was someone trained to understand criminal behavior, patterns, and consequences. Kohberger was arrested in late December of 2022 at his family's home in Pennsylvania. The arrest marked a turning point, but it did not bring immediate closure. Instead, it raised new questions. How could someone immersed in academic study of crime allegedly carry out such an act? Was this a failure of self-control, a disconnect between theory and morality, or something far more complex? He was extradited to Idaho and formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with 1 count of burglary. Prosecutors alleged that he entered the home during the early morning hours with intent, leaving behind evidence that ultimately led back to him. From a moment the charges were announced, the case became a focal point of national attention. Pretrial proceedings stretched on for months. Legal arguments unfolded, evidence was challenged, and the possibility of the death penalty loomed. For the families of the victims, the process was slow and emotionally exhausting. Each hearing reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Still, they showed up, determined to see the case through to its conclusion. In 2025, the case took a decisive turn. Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to all charges as part of a plea agreement that removed the death penalty from consideration. The decision ended speculation about a prolonged trial, but left one critical question unanswered. Why? Despite admitting guilt, Kohberger offered no explanation, no insight into motive, and no statement that might help others make sense of what had happened. Later that year, in July of 2025, sentencing took place. In a courtroom filled with grief and resolve, Kohberger received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each life taken. An additional sentence was imposed for the burglary charge. The judge spoke of accountability and permanence, emphasizing that the sentence ensured Kohberger would never re-enter society. Family members of the victims delivered statements that focused not on hatred, but on remembrance. They spoke of laughter, ambition, kindness, and futures that would never be realized. Their words shifted the narrative away from the offender and back to those who mattered most, the young lives that had been lost. Kohberger remained silent throughout the proceedings. That silence became part of the legacy of the case. Without a stated motive, the story ended not with understanding, but with finality. For many, the absence of explanation was as troubling as the crime itself. It served as a reminder that not all actions can be neatly categorized or fully understood. The impact on the Moscow community lingered long after sentencing. Students returned to campus with heightened awareness, and trust had to be rebuilt slowly. Ordinary routines now carried the weight of memory. The tragedy reshaped how safety, proximity, and familiarity were perceived in college towns across the country. Today, Bryan Kohberger is incarcerated in Idaho, serving life sentences that ensure he will never be free again. His academic pursuits ended in confinement, and the theories he once studied now frame his own reality. The case remains a stark example of how knowledge does not equal morality, and how proximity to darkness does not guarantee immunity from it. The story of the Moscow murders is not just about crime. It is about shattered assumptions, unanswered questions, and the fragile line between observer and participant. And it leaves behind a haunting truth. Sometimes, the most disturbing realities emerge from places that once felt entirely safe. Robert Hansen, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, where winter darkness swallows the land for months and civilization feels like a distant memory, one man turned the frozen landscape into his personal hunting ground. But Robert Hansen wasn't tracking elk or caribou. He was hunting human beings. For over a decade, he abducted women, flew them into the remote backcountry, and hunted them like animals. The question that haunts investigators even now is simple yet profound. How many never made it out of those woods? Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Esterville, Iowa. His early years were marked by relentless bullying and social rejection. He suffered from a severe stutter and acne that left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. Classmates mocked him, girls rejected him, He retreated into solitude, finding comfort in the one thing he excelled at: hunting. In the woods, with a rifle in his hands, Hansen felt powerful. In the woods, he was in control. That sense of power would later twist into something far darker. After a troubled youth that included minor run-ins with law enforcement, Hansen joined the Army Reserve, married, and eventually relocated to Anchorage, Alaska, in 1967. On the surface, he appeared to have turned his life around. He opened a bakery that became successful and well-regarded in the community. He had a wife and 2 children. He was a respected member of local hunting clubs, winning competitions and earning recognition for his skills. Neighbors saw him as a quiet, hard-working family man. But behind that carefully constructed facade, Robert Hansen was living a double life. The transformation likely began in the early 1970s. Hansen started frequenting areas where women engaged in activities often driven by desperation or vulnerability. He would offer them money, lure them to his vehicle, and then the nightmare would begin. Some he assaulted and released. Others were never seen again. What made Hansen particularly dangerous was his knowledge of the Alaskan wilderness. He was an experienced pilot with his own plane and an expert outdoorsman who knew the remote regions around Anchorage better than almost anyone. His method was chillingly deliberate. After abducting his victims, Hansen would fly them to isolated locations in the wilderness, areas so remote that screams would never be heard and bodies might never be found. Then came the most horrifying part. He would release them into the woods and hunt them. With a rifle or a knife, he would stalk them through the trees, turning their desperate attempts to survive into his personal sport. For Hansen, this was the ultimate expression of the power he had been denied his entire life. The boy who had been humiliated and rejected was now the one in control, the one with all the power over life and death. For years, his activities went undetected. When women disappeared from Anchorage's streets, few people paid attention. Some were reported missing by concerned friends or family, but many cases went uninvestigated or were quickly dismissed. The victims Hansen targeted were often marginalized. People's society had already failed. This allowed him to operate with terrifying freedom. How many chances did law enforcement miss? How many reports were ignored or downplayed? The case began to crack in June 1983, when 17-year-old Cindy Paulson managed to escape. Hansen had abducted her at gunpoint, taken her to his home, and assaulted her before driving her toward his plane. But Cindy saw an opportunity and ran. She flagged down a truck driver and told police her story, even identifying Hansen's home. But incredibly, when confronted, Hansen provided an alibi. His wife supported his story. He was a respected businessman. The investigation stalled. It wasn't until September 1983, when hunters discovered bodies in the wilderness, that authorities began connecting the dots. The remains showed evidence of violence, and ballistics tests on recovered evidence pointed back to weapons Hansen owned. Finally, investigators obtained a warrant to search his home. What they found confirmed their worst fears: jewelry and identification belonging to missing women, weapons matching the ballistics evidence, and aviation maps with locations marked in the wilderness. Under mounting evidence, Hansen eventually confessed. Between 1971 and 1983, he admitted to taking the lives of 17 women, though investigators believe the actual number could be significantly higher. He provided locations where he had left bodies, leading police to remains that might never have been discovered otherwise. But even in confession, Hansen maintained a disturbing sense of detachment, describing his actions with the same casual tone one might use to discuss a hunting trip. In February 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison plus life, without the possibility of parole. He was sent to serve his time far from Alaska, eventually ending up in Pennsylvania. He died on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75, taking with him secrets about victims whose families still search for answers. The case of Robert Hansen exposed how easily someone can hide in plain sight, how society's indifference to certain victims can enable evil, and how the vast wilderness that makes Alaska beautiful can also make it the perfect place to hide unspeakable crimes. His story remains a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the baker next door, the family man, the award-winning hunter. And sometimes the wilderness holds secrets it will never fully reveal. Anthony Sowell. The smell was unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Yet for years, everyone found reasons to explain it away. Neighbors in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Cleveland complained about the stench drifting from a particular house, a sickly sweet odor that made them gag when the wind shifted. Some blamed the nearby sausage factory. Others thought it was sewage problems or rotting trash. No one wanted to believe the truth, that the smell was death itself, that 11 women had been reduced to decomposing remains hidden throughout a seemingly ordinary home. Anthony Sowell wasn't just hiding bodies. He was living among them, existing in a house of horrors while neighbors walked past every single day. How does someone become so comfortable with death that they can sleep surrounded by it? Anthony Edward Sowell was born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. His childhood was marked by instability and allegations of severe mistreatment that would later be cited as factors in his psychological development. He grew up in poverty, moving between relatives' homes, experiencing an environment where violence and dysfunction were normalized. Multiple family members later described inappropriate contact and physical punishment that went beyond discipline into cruelty. By the time he reached adolescence, Sowell had learned that the world was a place where the strong preyed on the weak, where survival meant being willing to hurt others before they hurt you. He joined the United States Marine Corps in 1978, serving for over a decade. On the surface, military service seemed to provide structure and purpose. He received honorable discharge in 1989 and returned to Cleveland. But whatever discipline the Marines instilled couldn't contain what was developing inside him. Within months of returning to civilian life, he committed his first known serious offense. In 1989, he lured a pregnant woman to his apartment and attacked her. The violence was brutal, prolonged, revealing someone who derived satisfaction from inflicting suffering. Convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, Sowell served his time and was released in 2005. He registered as required by law, lived with his stepmother briefly, then moved into a home on Imperial Avenue in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. The house was unremarkable from the outside, a typical residence in a working-class area struggling with poverty and the aftermath of industrial decline. Inside, Anthony Sowell began creating something that would shock even hardened investigators. His targets were vulnerable women, many struggling with substance dependency or working in survival economies on the streets. These were women society had largely forgotten, women whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger intensive investigations. Some had families who reported them missing, but in a city dealing with limited resources and numerous cases, not every disappearance received equal attention. Sowell understood this. He knew which victims would be missed and which would slip through the cracks of an overburdened system. His method was consistent. He would approach women in the neighborhood, offer them money or substances, invite them to his house. Once inside, they were trapped. The attacks were savage, often involving strangulation. After taking their lives, Sowell didn't dispose of the bodies. Instead, he kept them. Some were buried in the basement or backyard. Others were hidden in crawl spaces or simply left in rooms throughout the house. As decomposition progressed, the smell intensified, seeping through walls, drifting into the street, causing neighbors to complain repeatedly. The complaint started as early as 2007. Residents called the city, reported the unbearable odor, demanded someone investigate. Officials inspected the nearby Ray's Sausage Company, citing them for violations, assuming the smell originated there. The factory owner protested, insisting the odor wasn't from his business, but the complaints were redirected there anyway. Meanwhile, Anthony Sowell continued operating from his house of horrors, protected by assumptions and bureaucratic misdirection. How many women could have been saved if someone had investigated more thoroughly? The truth emerged on October 29, 2009, when police arrived at the Imperial Avenue house to arrest Sowell for an assault allegation. A woman had reported being attacked by him days earlier, and managed to escape. When officers entered the home to execute the arrest warrant, they discovered something beyond their worst imaginings. Bodies, remains in various stages of decomposition, evidence of violence throughout the property. The house wasn't just a crime scene, it was a graveyard. The subsequent investigation uncovered 11 victims, all women, ranging in age from 25 to 52. Many had struggled with addiction or lived on the margins of society. Crystal Dozier, 35. Tizhana Culver, 31. Lashanda Long, 25. Tonia Carmichael, 52. Nancy Cobbs, 43. Imelda Hunter, 47. Talasha Fortson, 31. Kim Yvette Smith, 44. Janice Webb, 48. Diane Turner, 38. Michelle Mason, 45. Each name represented a life dismissed, a disappearance not prioritized, a family left wondering what happened to someone they loved. Anthony Sowell fled after police began their search, but was captured 2 days later, hiding in a vacant house nearby. During interrogation, he showed no remorse, no recognition of the enormity of what he had done. He spoke about his actions matter-of-factly, as if discussing something mundane rather than the systematic destruction of human lives. Psychiatric evaluations would later attempt to dissect his psychology, searching for explanations in his traumatic childhood, his military service, his previous incarceration. But understanding why someone does something doesn't change what they did or excuse the suffering they caused. The trial began in June 2011. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. The body's DNA linking Sowell to the victims, testimonies from women who survived encounters with him, the physical layout of the house showing where remains had been hidden. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, claiming Sowell couldn't control his impulses, that his troubled past had damaged him beyond repair. But the jury wasn't persuaded. The attacks were too calculated, too methodical, too clearly the work of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. On August 10, 2011, Anthony Sowell was convicted of multiple counts, including aggravated violence and abuse of corpses. The jury recommended execution, and on August 12th, the judge sentenced him accordingly. He was sent to death row in Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he would spend years awaiting execution while appeals worked through the system. He never made it to the execution chamber. On February 26, 2021, at age 61, Anthony Sowell died from a terminal illness while still imprisoned. His death brought an end to his life, but not to the questions his case raised. How did he operate for so long in a neighborhood where people complained about the smell? Why weren't missing women's cases investigated more aggressively? What systemic failures allowed 11 women to disappear before anyone connected them to the house on Imperial Avenue? The case exposed uncomfortable truths about which victims receive attention and which are overlooked. The women Anthony Sowell targeted were vulnerable, marginalized, often struggling with issues that made them invisible to broader society. Their families mourned them, but the system didn't prioritize finding them until bodies literally began appearing. This wasn't unique to Cleveland. Across America, certain victims receive immediate media attention, massive search efforts, and dedicated resources, while others disappear into statistics, their cases filed away and forgotten. The house on Imperial Avenue was eventually demolished, the city unable to decontaminate a structure so thoroughly saturated with death. A memorial garden was proposed for the site, a place where families could remember the 11 women whose lives ended there. But no garden can truly compensate for lives lost, for opportunities missed to stop a predator before his body count reached double digits, for a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable among us. Anthony Sowell's story is a reminder that monsters don't always hide in remote locations. Sometimes they live in regular neighborhoods, in houses where people walk past every day. And sometimes the signs are right there, the smell in the air, the complaints that go unaddressed, the disappearances that don't trigger alarm. The question isn't just how someone becomes capable of such horror. It's how the rest of us become so willing to look away. Aileen Wuornos. Some stories refuse to fit into neat categories. no matter how desperately we try to force them. America's first modern female serial killer shattered every expectation about who commits such acts and why. Between 1989 and 1990, along the desolate highways of Florida, Aileen Wuornos shot, killed, and robbed 7 of her male clients while working as a street-level companion. Her case became a lightning rod for debate about victimhood, responsibility, and the thin line between survival and savagery. Was she a cold-blooded predator who deserved her fate? Or was she the product of a lifetime of violence that finally exploded? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that she was both. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, into circumstances that seemed designed to destroy her before she even had a chance. Her mother was 16 years old, married at 14. Her biological father was sentenced to life imprisonment for horrific acts against a child and later took his own life in prison. Before Aileen could form memories, she was abandoned. Her mother left, unable or unwilling to care for her children. Aileen and her brother were raised by their maternal grandparents, but the household offered no refuge from the chaos. What happens to a child raised without safety, without protection, without anyone to show them that the world can be kind? The abuse started early. By her own account, Aileen experienced physical and inappropriate contact from family members, left to fend for herself in ways no child should have to endure. She described being forced to engage in activities for cigarettes and spare change while still in elementary school. By age 14, she became pregnant following an assault by a friend of her grandfather. The baby was given up for adoption. Shortly after, her grandmother passed away, and her grandfather threw her out. At 15 years old, Aileen Wuornos was homeless, living in abandoned cars in the Michigan woods during brutal winters, surviving however she could. She drifted through her late teens and 20s, moving from state to state, accumulating arrests for minor offenses. In 1976, she briefly married a wealthy man in his 70s named Louis Fell, but the marriage dissolved quickly after she became violent toward him. By the early 1980s, Aileen had made her way to Florida, where she supported herself through street-level work along the highways, exchanging intimacy for money that kept her fed and sheltered. It was a dangerous life, one where violence from clients was common, where women disappeared and no one asked questions, where survival meant learning to expect the worst from every encounter. Then came late 1989. Aileen shot and killed Richard Mallory, 51, after they went to a remote area in Central Florida for a transaction. She later claimed he became violent, that he assaulted her, that she fired in self-defense. Whether this first incident truly was self-defense or something darker will never be known with certainty. But what followed over the next year was undeniable. 6 more men died. David Spears, 47. Charles Carskadden, 40. Troy Burress, 50. Charles Humphreys, 56. Walter Antonio, 62. And Peter Seams, whose body was never found, but whose abandoned vehicle connected him to the case. The pattern was consistent. Victims were typically taken to an isolated place, shot several times and robbed. Their bodies were discovered days or weeks later, left in wooded areas along Florida's highways. Their vehicles were stolen, driven briefly, then abandoned. The randomness of the victims made the case difficult to solve initially. These weren't personal vendettas or crimes of passion. They were executions followed by robbery, carried out with a .22 caliber handgun that left behind a trail of evidence law enforcement would eventually follow. The investigation gained traction in July 1990 when a car belonging to Peter Seams crashed in Orange Springs, Florida. Witnesses described 2 women fleeing the scene. Composite sketches were created and circulated. Tips started coming in. By January 1991, authorities had names: Aileen Wuornos and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. The two had been in a relationship since 1986, with Tyria seemingly the one person Aileen trusted completely. That trust would become the key to breaking the case. Police arrested Aileen on an outstanding warrant and brought Tyria in for questioning. Tyria agreed to cooperate, making recorded phone calls to Aileen from jail. During those calls, Aileen confessed to protect Tyria, insisting her girlfriend knew nothing, taking full responsibility for everything. It was an act of love that sealed her fate. Aileen Wuornos confessed to protect her girlfriend who betrayed her to police, and those confessions became the foundation of the prosecution's case. The trials began in January 1992. Aileen initially claimed self-defense, describing years of violence from clients, painting a picture of a woman fighting back against predators. But as the trials progressed, her story changed. She admitted the acts weren't all self-defense. She acknowledged robbery as a motive. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, and the jury convicted her. She received multiple sentences, culminating in execution orders that would keep her on death row for over a decade. During her years awaiting execution, Aileen Wuornos became a media phenomenon. She gave interviews, spoke to filmmakers, became the subject of documentaries, and eventually the Oscar-winning film Monster. She was charismatic, contradictory, sometimes remorseful, other times defiant. She spoke truths about the violence women in her profession faced, about how society ignored their suffering. But she also admitted to acts that went beyond self-defense, that crossed into something colder, something driven by rage and desperation, and perhaps something darker still. On October 9, 2002, at age 46, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final words referenced being with Jesus. Her ashes were scattered in Michigan by a childhood friend, the only person from her early life who still cared enough to give her that final dignity. The case of Aileen Wuornos refuses simple answers. She was a victim of horrific abuse from childhood, abandoned by every system meant to protect her, forced into a life where violence was currency and survival meant accepting unacceptable things. She was also someone who took 7 lives, who fired bullets into men and took their possessions, who crossed a line from victim to perpetrator. Can both things be true? Can someone be shaped by trauma and still be responsible for their choices? Her story forces uncomfortable questions about how society treats the most vulnerable. How many chances did Aileen Wuornos never receive? How many times was she failed before she began failing others? And how many women in similar circumstances are out there right now, one bad decision away from following a similar path? The answers matter because Aileen Wuornos, for all her crimes, was still a human being. Understanding how she became what she became might prevent the next tragedy, or it might simply remind us that some damage, once done, can never fully be undone. Alexander Pichushkin. He wanted to fill a chessboard. 64 squares, 64 victims, a perfect numerical symmetry that would cement his place in history. Alexander Pichushkin didn't just take lives. He kept score, placing a coin on his chessboard for each person he claimed, treating human existence like pieces in a game only he understood. In the sprawling parks and quiet corners of Moscow, he became known as the chessboard killer, a man whose obsession with numbers and notoriety drove him to commit acts that would terrorize an entire city. But what transforms a human being into someone who views other people as mere tallies toward goal? Alexander Yuyevich Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974, in Moscow, Russia. His early childhood seemed typical until a seemingly minor incident changed everything. At age 4, he fell off a swing and struck his head, an injury that some would later point to as a potential catalyst for his behavioral changes. After the accident, teachers and family members noticed differences. He became more aggressive, more withdrawn, struggled with social connections. Whether the injury fundamentally altered his brain or simply revealed tendencies that would have emerged anyway remains a question without a clear answer. Growing up in the Bitsevsky Park area of Moscow, Pichushkin was a lonely child who found solace in chess. The game gave him structure, rules, predictability in a world that often felt chaotic. He spent hours playing, studying strategies, memorizing moves. But as he grew older, something darker began to develop alongside his love for the game. He started viewing people through the same lens he viewed chess pieces, objects to be manipulated, sacrificed, removed from a board. When did the game stop being enough? When did he decide that real lives could satisfy whatever void existed inside him? His first known attack came in 1992 when he was just 18 years old. He invited a former classmate to Bitsevsky Park, got him intoxicated, and pushed him off a bridge. The young man survived, though with serious injuries, but Pichushkin had crossed a threshold. He had attempted to take a life and felt something in that moment, something that would pull him back again and again. The power, the control, the godlike decision over who lives and who doesn't. For someone who felt powerless in most aspects of his life, this became an addiction. He wouldn't act again for several years, living a quiet existence, working as a supermarket porter, caring for his elderly mother. To neighbors and co-workers, he was unremarkable, perhaps a bit odd, but harmless. They had no idea that inside his apartment, he was planning, fantasizing, preparing for what would become over a decade of violence. In 2001, something triggered him to start again, and this time he wouldn't stop. Pichushkin developed a pattern that was both calculated and opportunistic. He targeted vulnerable individuals, often elderly men and women, homeless people, those who might not be immediately missed. He would approach them in Bitsevsky Park, offer them vodka, engage them in conversation, gain their trust. Then, in isolated areas of the park, he would attack with hammers, rocks, or his bare hands. Many victims were found with severe head trauma. Some were thrown into sewers while still alive, left to perish in the darkness below the city streets. The park became his territory, his hunting ground. He knew every path, every secluded area, every manhole cover. He moved through it like a ghost. And for years, authorities didn't connect the disappearances and bodies. Moscow was a big city with its share of violence and tragedy. Homeless people went missing. Elderly people died. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious. How many chances were missed? How many victims could have been saved if someone had connected the dots sooner? But Pichushkin was keeping count. In his apartment, he maintained a chessboard where he marked each victim, filling the squares one by one. His goal was clear: 64 victims, one for each square. He later claimed to investigators that he had surpassed this number, that he had actually killed more than 60 victims. Whether this was truth or the boasting of a man desperate for notoriety remains unclear. He wanted recognition, wanted to surpass other notorious figures, wanted his name remembered. In his twisted logic, the more people he harmed, the more significant he became. His capture in June 2006 came not from brilliant detective work, but from a simple mistake. After taking the life of a woman named Marina Moskolyova, he left a metro ticket in her apartment. Surveillance footage from a metro station showed Pichushkin and Moskolyova together. When police questioned him, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. He confessed, and once he started talking, he couldn't stop. He wanted to tell his story, to explain his methods, to ensure everyone understood what he had accomplished. During interrogation and trial, Pichushkin showed no genuine remorse. He spoke about his actions with disturbing casualness, describing details with the detachment of someone discussing a hobby. He complained that he hadn't reached his goal of 64, that his arrest had interrupted his work. He requested that his victims be remembered, not out of respect for them, but because their deaths were part of his legacy. The narcissism, the complete lack of empathy, the inability to see victims as human beings with families and lives, all pointed to someone fundamentally broken. The trial gripped Russia. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. His confessions, physical evidence linking him to crime scenes, testimonies from the few who had survived encounters with him. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to his childhood head injury, but psychiatric evaluations found him competent to stand trial. On October 24th, 2007, Alexander Pichushkin was convicted of 48 counts and 3 attempted incidents. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the first 15 years in solitary confinement. Pichushkin is currently held in a maximum security facility where he will likely spend the rest of his life. The chessboard he kept, the macabre scorecard of his activities, remains evidence of a mind that reduced human existence to a game. Families of victims still mourn, still struggle with the randomness of their loss. Their loved ones weren't targeted for any reason other than availability, vulnerability, their presence in the wrong place at the wrong time. The case of Alexander Pichushkin raises uncomfortable questions about how we identify dangerous individuals before they act. He lived among ordinary people for years, harboring thoughts that would horrify anyone who knew him. He functioned in society, held a job, cared for his mother, all while planning his next move. How many others are out there, keeping their darkness hidden, waiting for the right moment? And how do we stop them before the chessboard starts filling with victims? John Wayne Gacy. What happens when a man who brings joy to children's parties becomes the architect of their worst nightmares? When a friendly neighbor who volunteers for community events is revealed to be hiding unspeakable horrors beneath his very floors. John Wayne Gacy's story forced America to confront a terrifying truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself with darkness. Sometimes it wears a smile, shakes your hand, and painted as a clown, makes your children laugh. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood was marked by a difficult relationship with his father, a man whose approval seemed forever out of reach. Despite this, Gacy worked hard to present himself as successful and likable. He married, had children, and became active in his community. In the 1960s, he managed Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants and joined the JCs, a civic organization where he seemed to thrive. To everyone watching, he was a man on the rise, someone who cared about his community and worked tirelessly to prove his worth. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of an offense involving a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa. He served 18 months before his release. His wife divorced him, and he lost contact with his children. Most people in a situation might have disappeared from public life, but not Gacy. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his image and restart his life. And for a while, it seemed to work. By the 1970s, Gacy had remarried and was running a successful construction business. He became known in his suburban Chicago neighborhood as a helpful, hardworking man. He threw elaborate parties, dressed as Pogo the Clown to entertain at children's hospitals and charity events, and even had his picture taken with First Lady Rosalynn Carter. How could anyone suspect that this pillar of the community was capable of monstrous acts? The contrast between his public persona and his private actions would become one of the most disturbing aspects of his case. What no one knew was that young men and boys were disappearing. Gacy would lure them with promises of construction work or other opportunities. Once under his control, he would subject them to unimaginable treatment before ending their lives. For years, he disposed of remains in the crawl space beneath his house, and when that space filled, he turned to other methods. The scope of his actions was almost incomprehensible. How could someone commit such acts and then return to everyday life, smiling at neighbors and playing the role of a community leader? The truth began to unravel in December 1978. A 15-year-old named Robert Piest went missing after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When investigators looked into Gacy's background, they discovered his previous conviction. Surveillance began, and Gacy knew he was being watched. The pressure mounted, and on December 21, 1978, he confessed to investigators. What they found beneath his house shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The remains of 29 young men and boys were recovered from the crawl space. 4 more victims have been disposed of in a nearby river. 33 lives stolen, 33 families destroyed. The youngest victim was just 14 years old. The investigation revealed a pattern of calculated deception and violence that had gone undetected for years. Gacy had hidden in plain sight, protected by his reputation and his ability to charm those around him. The trial began in February 1980 in Chicago. Gacy's defense team argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he had multiple personalities and was not in control of his actions. The prosecution presented a different picture: a man who carefully planned his actions, ran a successful business, and was fully aware of what he was doing. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified about Gacy's behavior. Investigators detailed what they had found, and the families of victims shared their pain with the court. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On March 13, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on 33 counts. He was sentenced to death. For 14 years, he sat on death row, giving interviews, creating paintings, and maintaining that he was somehow misunderstood or that others were responsible. He showed little genuine remorse. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His last words were reportedly dismissive, offering no comfort to the families still grieving their losses. But the questions his case raised have never fully disappeared. How did he evade suspicion for so long? What allowed him to present two completely different faces to the world? The case of John Wayne Gacy changed how law enforcement approached missing persons cases and highlighted the danger of assuming that respectability equals innocence. It reminded America that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they live next door, wave from their driveways, and entertain at block parties. Today, Gacy's name remains synonymous with calculated evil hiding behind normalcy. His victims are remembered not for how they died, but for the lives they should have lived. And his story continues to serve as a dark reminder. Trust, once given, can be the most dangerous gift of all. Can we ever truly know the people around us? Or are some secrets buried too deep to see until it's far too late? Mikhail Popkov. Trust is the invisible thread that holds society together. We trust doctors to heal us, teachers to educate our children, and police officers to protect us from harm. But what happens when that trust becomes a weapon? Mikhail Popkov wore a police uniform by day, patrolling the streets of Angarsk and Irkutsk in Siberia, sworn to serve and protect. By night, he used that same uniform to lure women to their deaths, transforming the symbol of safety into a tool of unspeakable horror. For over 2 decades, he operated in plain sight. And the question that haunts Russia to this day is simple. How did a police officer become one of the most prolific offenders in recorded history? Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov was born on March 3, 1964, in the Siberian city of Angarsk. His early life appeared unremarkable. He grew up during the Soviet era, attended school, and seemed like countless other young men in industrial Siberia. After completing his education, he joined the police force in 1986, beginning a career that would span decades. Colleagues described him as competent, reliable, someone who did his job without drawing attention. He married, had a daughter, lived in a modest apartment. To everyone who knew him, Mikhail Popkov was ordinary, forgettable even. But behind the facade of normalcy, something deeply disturbed was taking shape. What creates a person capable of such sustained violence? Popkov later claimed his actions stemmed from a warped sense of morality. He targeted women he deemed immoral, those walking alone at night, those he believed were engaged in activities he found objectionable. In his twisted logic, he was cleansing society, removing what he saw as undesirable elements. But this justification, this attempt to frame horrific acts as some kind of moral crusade, revealed the depth of his delusion. These weren't abstractions or symbols. They were human beings with families, dreams, lives that mattered. His method was chillingly simple and devastatingly effective. Working as a police officer gave Popkov access to a patrol car, a uniform, and most importantly, authority. Late at night, he would patrol areas where women walked alone. He would pull over, flash his badge, and offer them a ride. In Siberia's brutal climate, where winter temperatures plunge far below zero, a warm car from a police officer seemed like salvation, not danger. How could they refuse? How could they know that accepting help from someone sworn to protect them would be their final decision? Once the women were in his vehicle, Popkov would drive to isolated locations far from the city. What happened next was systematic brutality. He attacked with whatever was available: axes, hammers, knives, screwdrivers. The violence was extreme, excessive, revealing a rage that went far beyond his claims of moral cleansing. After taking their lives, he would dispose of the bodies in remote areas, forests, and abandoned locations where they might not be found for weeks, months, or sometimes ever. The harsh Siberian landscape became both his accomplice and his victim depository. The attacks began in 1992 and continued for years. Bodies were discovered periodically, but investigators struggled to connect them. The crimes spanned different jurisdictions, different time periods, different victim profiles. Some were young, some older. Some were found quickly, others remained missing for years. The lack of obvious pattern made it nearly impossible to identify a single perpetrator. Meanwhile, Popkov continued his double life, going to work each day, returning home to his family each night, all while carrying secrets that would horrify anyone who knew him. By the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology began changing the landscape of criminal investigation. DNA evidence, once rare and expensive, became more accessible. Russian authorities started systematically collecting and analyzing evidence from unsolved cases. In 2012, they decided to conduct mass DNA testing of men who had lived in the areas where attacks occurred during the relevant time periods. Thousands of men provided samples, including current and former police officers. Mikhail Popkov was among them. When his DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes, investigators were stunned. A police officer? Someone who had worked alongside them, who had perhaps even participated in investigations of the very crimes he committed. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department and the community. In June 2012, authorities arrested Popkov. During interrogation, he began confessing, providing details that only the perpetrator could know. He led investigators to burial sites, described specific victims, recounted methods and locations with disturbing clarity. The scope of his actions became clear during the trial. Prosecutors initially charged him with dozens of cases from the early 1990s through 2000. In January 2015, a court convicted him of involvement in 22 deaths and sentenced him to life imprisonment. But that wasn't the end. While in prison, Popkov continued confessing to additional crimes. He provided information about dozens more victims, cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Families who had spent years wondering what happened to their loved ones finally received terrible closure. In a second trial in December 2018, Popkov was convicted of an additional 56 incidents, bringing his confirmed total to 78 deaths, though he has claimed the actual number exceeds 80. This makes him one of the most prolific offenders in documented Russian history, surpassing even the infamous figures of previous decades. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. 78 families destroyed, 78 lives ended, more than 2 decades of unchecked violence. During his trials, Popkov showed little genuine remorse. He spoke about his actions in detached terms, still clinging to his narrative of moral cleansing, still attempting to justify the unjustifiable. Psychiatric evaluations found him sane and competent, capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions. He wasn't driven by mental illness or diminished capacity. He made choices, deliberate and repeated, for over 20 years. Mikhail Popkov remains imprisoned, serving life sentences in one of Russia's harshest correctional facilities. He will never see freedom again, but his case left lasting scars on the communities he terrorized and the police force he betrayed. It exposed critical failures in interjurisdictional communication, in evidence handling, in the willingness to consider that a predator might be hiding within law enforcement itself. How many women could have been saved if investigators had connected the pattern sooner? How many accepted rides from a uniformed officer, believing they were safe? The case forces us to confront an unsettling reality. The people we trust most, those we invest with authority and power, are still human. And some humans, despite their uniforms and badges and oaths, are capable of unimaginable evil. Mikhail Popkov didn't just betray his victims. He betrayed every person who ever trusted a police officer, every woman who ever accepted help from someone in uniform, every citizen who believed that those sworn to protect would never become predators themselves. Timothy McVeigh. April 19, 1995, started like any other spring morning in Oklahoma City. Parents dropped children off at daycare. Office workers grabbed their coffee. The day held promise, normalcy, routine. Then, at 9:02 in the morning, a massive explosion ripped through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, tearing away the entire north face and killing 168 people, including 19 children. In a single moment, domestic terrorism shattered America's sense of security in a way it had never experienced before. And the man responsible wasn't some foreign operative or shadowy international figure. He was an American military veteran who believed he was fighting for freedom. Timothy James McVeigh was born on April 23, 1968, in Lockport, New York. His childhood appeared unremarkable on the surface. His parents divorced when he was young, and he lived primarily with his father. Classmates remembered him as quiet, sometimes bullied, someone who kept to himself. He developed an early interest in firearms and survivalism, spending hours reading gun magazines and learning about weapons. After graduating high school, McVeigh drifted through a few jobs before finding his calling in the United States Army in 1988. The military seemed like the perfect fit for McVeigh. He excelled in basic training and eventually earned a position in the Army's 2nd Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment. He deployed to the Gulf War in 1991, where he served with distinction, earning a Bronze Star. Those who served with him described a dedicated soldier, someone who took his duties seriously. But something was changing inside Timothy McVeigh, something his fellow soldiers couldn't see. The government he served was becoming, in his mind, the enemy. After returning from the Gulf War, McVeigh attempted to qualify for the Army Special Forces, but withdrew from the rigorous selection process. He left the military in 1991 and drifted through various jobs, never finding the sense of purpose the Army had given him. During this time, his political views became increasingly extreme. He immersed himself in anti-government literature, convinced that federal authorities were overstepping their bounds and threatening American freedoms. Two events in particular fueled his growing rage: the incident at Ruby Ridge in 1992 and the standoff in Waco, Texas in 1993. The Waco siege, which ended on April 19, 1993, with a fire that claimed 76 lives, became McVeigh's breaking point. He visited the site during the standoff, witnessing the federal presence firsthand. In his mind, the government had declared war on its own citizens. He decided that someone needed to send a message, to strike back, to show that actions have consequences. That someone, he decided, would be him. What drives a person to plan mass violence? McVeigh spent 2 years preparing, driven by a twisted sense of patriotism and revenge. He recruited former Army buddy Terry Nichols to help him. Together, they gathered materials, planned logistics, and selected their target, the Murrah Federal Building, chosen because it housed offices of federal agencies McVeigh blamed for Waco and other perceived government overreach. Did he consider the innocent lives inside, the children in the daycare center? He later claimed he viewed them as collateral damage, a cold and calculated justification that revealed the depth of his detachment from humanity. On April 19, 1995, exactly 2 years after Waco, McVeigh drove a rented Ryder truck packed with a massive fertilizer-based device to the front of the Murrah building. He parked, lit the fuse, and walked away. The explosion was heard miles away, creating a crater 30 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The building's entire north face collapsed. Rescuers worked for days, pulling survivors and remains from the rubble. Among the dead were children who had been playing in the daycare center just moments before. The images from that day, of firefighters carrying injured children, of the building's skeletal remains, became seared into America's collective memory. McVeigh's capture came not from sophisticated detective work, but from a routine traffic stop. Just 90 minutes after the blast, an Oklahoma Highway Patrol trooper pulled over a yellow Mercury Marquis traveling without license plates. The driver was Timothy McVeigh. The trooper discovered he was carrying a loaded firearm and arrested him on weapons charges. McVeigh sat in jail for 2 days on these charges before investigators connected him to the bombing. Had that trooper not been observant, McVeigh might have disappeared. The trial became one of the most watched in American history. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence. McVeigh's fingerprints on documents used to rent the truck, testimonies from witnesses who placed him at the scene, and his own statements to friends about his plans. The defense argued he was a scapegoat, that others were involved, but the evidence was irrefutable. On June 2, 1997, the jury convicted him on all counts. The sentencing phase was brief. Timothy McVeigh was sentenced to death. Unlike many who commit such acts, McVeigh never expressed genuine remorse. He remained defiant, comparing himself to a soldier following orders in war. He granted interviews, wrote letters, and maintained that his actions were justified responses to government tyranny. This lack of remorse, this steadfast belief in his righteousness, made him even more disturbing. How could someone see such devastation, such loss of innocent life, and feel no regret? On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 33 years old. His final statement was a handwritten copy of the poem Invictus, ending with the line, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." The Oklahoma City bombing changed America forever. It shattered the belief that terrorism was something that only happened elsewhere, perpetrated by foreign enemies. It showed that the greatest threats can come from within, from those who wrap themselves in the flag, while attacking everything it represents. 168 families lost loved ones because one man decided his grievances justified mass violence. And the questions remain. How do we identify such dangerous ideology before it manifests in violence? How do we prevent others from following the same path? Israel Keyes. What happens when someone plans evil not in the heat of passion, not from trauma or rage, but with the cold precision of an architect designing a building? Israel Keyes didn't just commit crimes. He engineered them years in advance, burying murder kits across the country like twisted time capsules, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that some people don't become monsters through circumstance. They choose it methodically, deliberately, and with chilling patience. Born on January 7, 1978, Israel Keyes grew up in a strict religious household that moved frequently across the United States. His childhood was marked by isolation, homeschooling, and a family culture that kept the outside world at arm's length. But unlike many who point to difficult childhoods as the source of their crimes, Keyes seemed to have made his choices independent of his upbringing. He was intelligent, capable, and by all outward appearances, ordinary. He served in the United States Army, received an honorable discharge, and later started a construction business in Alaska. He had a daughter. He had relationships. He lived among people who had no idea what he was. That's what made Israel Keyes so terrifying. He wasn't the loner everyone suspected. He wasn't the obvious outcast. He was the neighbor who seemed normal, the contractor who did good work, the father who picked up his child from school. How do you spot evil when it wears such a convincing mask? Keyes admitted to his first offense in 1996, though the full extent of his activities likely began even earlier. What set him apart from other offenders wasn't just the number of victims, but the methodology. He didn't operate in one area. He didn't have a type. He planned his actions with a level of foresight that chilled even seasoned investigators. Years before he would commit an act, Keyes would travel to distant locations and bury kill kits containing weapons, cash, and tools. He would then return months or even years later, retrieve his supplies, and carry out carefully planned attacks on randomly selected victims. This approach made him nearly impossible to track. There was no pattern to his victim selection, no geographic consistency, no predictable timeline. He chose people at random, often while traveling far from his home in Alaska, ensuring that no connection could be drawn between him and those he harmed. He paid for everything in cash, avoided surveillance cameras, and disabled his cell phone when carrying out his plans. In an age of digital footprints and constant connectivity, Keyes operated like a ghost. For over a decade, he moved through the country undetected. Investigators believe he was responsible for incidents in multiple states, though the exact number may never be known. Keyes himself claimed responsibility for several cases, but refused to provide complete information, enjoying the power that his secrets gave him over the authorities. He treated his confessions like a game, offering bits of information in exchange for conditions, maintaining control even after his capture. His downfall came in February 2012, when he abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from a coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska. Unlike his previous carefully planned attacks, this one was closer to home, and it would prove to be his fatal mistake. After taking Samantha's life, Keyes went on a cruise with his family, then traveled to Texas. He used her bank card to withdraw money, and those transactions created a trail that finally gave investigators something to follow. Federal agents tracked him to Texas and arrested him in March 2012. During interrogations, Keyes began to reveal the horrifying scope of his activities. He spoke calmly about his methods, his planning, his philosophy. He showed no remorse, only a kind of pride in his ability to evade detection for so long. He described his actions as though discussing a hobby, a passion project he had dedicated years to perfecting. But the full truth would never emerge. On December 2nd, 2012, while awaiting trial in an Anchorage jail, Israel Keyes took his own life. He left behind drawings, writings, and a final act of control. Even in death, he denied investigators and victims' families the closure they desperately needed. Questions remain unanswered. Cases remain unsolved. Families still wonder if Keyes was responsible for their missing loved ones. The case of Israel Keyes changed how law enforcement thinks about criminals who operate across jurisdictions. It exposed gaps in communication between agencies and the limitations of traditional profiling methods. How do you catch someone who refuses to follow any pattern? How do you predict someone who plans years in advance? How do you find victims when the perpetrator selected them completely at random? Israel Keyes proved that evil doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always leave obvious clues. Sometimes it plans, prepares, and waits with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world. And sometimes, the most frightening thing isn't what we know about people like him. It's what we'll never know, buried somewhere in the places he traveled, in the kits he may have hidden, in the secrets he took to his grave.